Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes, Deadly Ideologies Edition.
Yeah, today we're diving deep into Mein Kampf. I think a book that's as infamous as it is historically significant.
Yeah, this isn't exactly light reading, is it? We're talking about the autobiography and manifesto of Adolf Hitler,
Right?
a text that really laid the groundwork for Nazi ideology, and tragically, of course, some of the darkest events in human history.
Yeah, absolutely. And, while it's disturbing, understanding the ideas within Mein Kampf, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Right.
It's like studying a virus. The more we know about its structure, the better equipped we are to combat its spread.
I like that analogy. That's a good one. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, what are some of the main themes that we should be looking out for as we go through this?
Well, you'll see intense German nationalism, almost bordering on a belief in racial purity. Hitler repeatedly attacks what he calls the mongrelization of Germany,
Right.
advocating for a homogenous society.
Yeah, and that ties into, of course, his virulent anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
He blames Jews for a whole host of Germany's problems,
Right.
portraying them as this parasitic force that's undermining the nation.
Yes, and disturbingly, he glorifies violence and struggle.
Yeah,
For Hitler, these aren't just tools for political change, but they're essential elements of human existence.
right. And underpinning all of this is his belief in a strong, centralized state led by this, charismatic dictatorial figure.
Someone like himself. Yeah, Mein Kampf clearly lays out his ambition for absolute power.
Okay, so with those themes in mind, let's start at the beginning. Hitler spends a significant portion of the book detailing his childhood and youth. And one thing that struck me is how he already displays this fervent German nationalism, even though he was born in Austria.
That's a great observation. It's almost as if he's trying to retroactively justify his later actions by presenting this inherent Germanness from a young age.
Right.
You see, he paints a picture of himself as this lone wolf, rejecting the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire, yearning for a unified, powerful Germany.
Yeah, he talks about collecting pro-German pamphlets and getting in trouble for singing the German anthem, even getting upset when he realized some classmates weren't ethnically German.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, it's almost chilling how these seemingly minor incidents foreshadow his later obsession with racial purity.
Absolutely. And this sense of being different, of not belonging to the prevailing order, continues to play out in his description of Vienna.
Right.
It's fascinating how he portrays the city as a kind of Babylon, this chaotic mix of cultures and ethnicities that he finds repulsive.
And it's in Vienna where his anti-Semitism really takes root. He describes encountering Jews and becoming fixated on their perceived differences, eventually buying into all these conspiracy theories about Jewish control of finance and the media.
And it's important to note that Vienna at the time was a hotbed of anti-Semitic thought.
Of course, yeah.
So Hitler didn't invent these ideas, but he absorbed them, twisted them, and ultimately weaponized them for his own political agenda. So he takes these existing prejudices and crafts them into a full-blown conspiracy, blaming Jews for everything from economic hardship to the decline of art and culture.
It's almost like he's trying to find a scapegoat, someone to blame for his own feelings of frustration and powerlessness.
That's a very insightful point, and it's a
Logic.
pattern we see repeated throughout the book. Whenever Hitler encounters a problem or a setback, he invariably finds a way to blame it on the Jews.
Yeah. And then comes World War I, which he initially embraces with almost religious fervor. He describes the camaraderie of the trenches, the thrill of battle, but then, of course, comes the crushing defeat, which completely shatters his worldview.
And this is where the stab-in-the-back myth really comes into play.
Right.
He refuses to accept that Germany was legitimately defeated, instead latching onto this idea that the army was betrayed by internal enemies.
Yeah, he names Jews and Marxists as the primary culprits, claiming they undermined the war effort from within. And, reading this, you could almost feel the bitterness and the resentment oozing off the page.
Right.
It's clear that this myth becomes a core element of his ideology, fueling his desire for revenge and justifying his future aggression.
Absolutely. And this myth wasn't just some fringe conspiracy theory.
Right.
It became this powerful narrative that resonated with many Germans who were struggling to come to terms with the trauma of defeat.
Okay.
And it's important to recognize how this kind of historical revisionism can lay the groundwork for future atrocities.
Yeah, it's like he's rewriting history to fit his own warped narrative,
Yeah.
setting the stage for the violence and the persecution that would follow.
Exactly. And this manipulation of historical narratives is something we see even today, with various groups twisting facts and events to fit their own agendas.
So, disillusioned and embittered by the war, Hitler finds his way into this fledgling Nazi party. And it's here, in this kind of chaotic political landscape of post-war Germany, that his skills as a speaker and a propagandist really come to the forefront.
He describes attending political meetings, observing how different speakers engaged the crowd. It's fascinating how he dissects the techniques of other orators, almost like he's studying a scientific formula.
Yeah.
And you can see him absorbing these lessons, honing his own style, and ultimately becoming the master manipulator that we know him to be.
Yeah, he talks about the importance of using simple, emotional language, of appealing to people's base instincts rather than their intellect.
Right.
It's all about stirring up their anger, their resentment, their fear.
And you see this reflected in his choice of language.
Yeah.
You know, he repeatedly uses inflammatory rhetoric, demonizing his opponents, painting these vivid pictures of imagined threats.
Right.
You know, it's clear that he's not interested in reasoned debate or compromise.
Right.
He wants to incite action, to mobilize the masses for his own revolutionary cause.
It's chilling how he outlines his propaganda strategy with such cold, calculated precision.
Right.
He even talks about using symbols and spectacle to create a sense of awe and power.
This is where the infamous Nazi rallies come in.
Right.
You know, he understood the power of imagery,
Yeah.
of creating these massive, carefully orchestrated events that would overwhelm the senses and evoke a sense of unity and purpose.
Right.
It's a technique that's been used throughout history to manipulate and control the masses.
And it's incredibly effective. You know, he transforms the Nazi Party from this fringe group into this mass movement, tapping into the anxieties and the frustrations of a population struggling to cope with the aftermath of war and economic collapse.
Absolutely. And within this context, Mein Kampf becomes more than just a personal manifesto.
Right.
It transforms into a blueprint for achieving power, a guidebook for revolution,
Right.
and a terrifying foreshadowing of the horrors to come.
Yeah, and that's where, you know, the truly disturbing aspects of Mein Kampf come into
Yeah.
focus. It's not just about gaining power. It's about what he plans to do with that power.
Yeah, a big part of that is his vision for reshaping German society. And it's this kind of this strange mix of utopian and dystopian ideals.
He talks about creating this Volksgemeinschaft, this national community where everyone is united by their shared blood and loyalty to the Nazi Party.
It sounds appealing on the surface, right?
Yeah, it does.
This sense of belonging, a shared purpose. But it's all built on this foundation of racial purity and exclusion.
Right.
Anyone who doesn't fit into his narrow definition of German is deemed an enemy.
And that's where his obsession with racial hygiene comes in. He talks about eliminating undesirable elements from the German population, primarily Jews, but also Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, anyone he deems a threat to the purity of the Aryan race.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just abstract theorizing.
Right.
He lays out concrete plans for achieving this racial purity, plans that would ultimately lead to the horrors of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It's chilling to read about forced sterilization, segregation, and ultimately his intention for genocide, all laid out in black and white.
It's a stark reminder that ideas have consequences,
Yeah,
that words can be used to incite, unimaginable cruelty.
absolutely. And we see that cruelty reflected in his vision for the new man.
Right.
He talks about creating a generation of physically fit, ideologically pure warriors completely devoted to the Nazi cause.
He wants to mold the German people in his own image, essentially.
Yeah.
It's a vision that's, deeply disturbing, especially when you consider his glorification of war and violence.
He sees war as not just inevitable, but desirable.
Right.
It's a test of strength, crucible for forging a new order. It's almost as if he wants conflict, seeing it as a necessary part of human existence.
And that ties into his critique of the Weimar Republic, right?
Yes.
He despises its weakness,
Yeah.
its inability to take decisive action.
Yeah.
He wants a strong, centralized leader.
Power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual who embodies the will of the people. It is a rejection of democracy and a glorification of authoritarianism.
Yeah, and he's very clear about his disdain for individual liberty.
Right.
He sees freedom as a weakness that must be suppressed in the name of national unity and strength.
It's a terrifying vision of a society where everyone thinks and acts the same way,
Yeah.
where dissent is crushed and individual rights are trampled. It's the blueprint for a totalitarian nightmare.
Okay, and then there's his economic vision.
Right.
He rejects both capitalism and communism, calling for a kind of national socialist economy that's heavily controlled by the state.
It's a strange mix of ideas, really. On the one hand, he wants to promote German industry and economic self-sufficiency.
Right.
But on the other hand, he's willing to use the power of the state to manipulate the economy, setting prices, dictating production quotas, regulating trade.
And his obsession with autarky, with economic independence, is particularly interesting to me. It seems almost paranoid,
Right.
this fear of being reliant on other nations.
Yeah, and it ultimately backfires. His economic policies based more on ideology than sound economic principles lead to shortages, rationing, decline in the standard of living for many Germans.
It's a reminder that even the most carefully crafted plans can have unintended consequences, especially when they're driven by ideology rather than pragmatism.
Absolutely.
Speaking of carefully crafted plans, we can't ignore Hitler's emphasis on the importance of propaganda.
Right.
It's more than just a tool for him. It's almost an art form.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
He dedicates a whole chapter of Mein Kampf to outlining his theories on propaganda. It's chilling how he breaks down its principles, emphasizing the need for simplicity, repetition, and emotional appeal.
He argues that propaganda must target the masses, not the intellectual elite.
Right.
It's about appealing to people's base instincts, their fears, their prejudices, their desires.
And he's very clear that the truth is irrelevant in propaganda.
Right.
What matters is what people believe, not what's actually true. He even says the receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. It's a cynical and manipulative view of human nature.
Yeah, and it's incredibly effective. He understands that people are more likely to be swayed by emotion than by reason, and he uses this to his advantage. Think about the imagery he uses, the flags, the uniforms, the rallies. It's all designed to create a visceral, emotional response.
He creates this cult of personality around himself,
Right.
portraying himself as the savior of Germany, the only one who can lead the nation to greatness.
Yeah, and he's very effective at creating scapegoats.
Right.
Blaming Jews, communists, and other groups for all of Germany's problems. He understands that people need someone to blame, someone to hate, and he provides them with easy targets.
It's a reminder that we must always be critical of the information we receive, especially from those who have a vested interest in shaping our opinions. We can't just passively consume information. We have to actively engage with it, question it, and be willing to challenge those who seek to manipulate us.
Absolutely, and that's especially important in today's world,
Right.
where we're constantly bombarded with information from a variety of sources, many of which have their own agendas. We have to be discerning consumers of information,
Right, yeah.
able to separate fact from fiction, truth from propaganda.
Now, all of this ties into Hitler's vision for the future of Germany,
Right.
a vision that is both grandiose and terrifying.
Yes.
He dreams of a racially pure, militarily powerful German empire that will dominate Europe and eventually the world.
It's a vision rooted in his belief in the inherent superiority of the German people,
Right.
his twisted interpretation of history, and his insatiable thirst for power.
Yeah, he outlines his plans for achieving this goal, including the conquest and colonization of Eastern Europe, the extermination of the Jews, the establishment of a totalitarian state that will control every aspect of German life.
It's a horrifying blueprint for the nightmare that would become a reality for millions of people during World War II.
And it's a reminder that ideas have consequences,
Yeah.
that seemingly abstract theories can have real-world impacts, often with devastating results.
Yeah, it's also a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. We have to be vigilant in defending our freedoms, challenging injustice, and resisting those who seek to divide us and promote hatred.
And I think it's important to note that even though Mein Kampf was written in the 1920s, many of the themes and ideas that it explores are still relevant today.
You're absolutely right. We still see the same kind of divisive rhetoric,
Right.
the same scapegoating of minorities, the same glorification of violence and authoritarianism.
Yeah, think about the rise of nationalism and populism around the world, the spread of misinformation and propaganda online,
Right.
the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. These are all echoes of the themes that we see in Mein Kampf.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the fight against hatred, bigotry, and authoritarianism is an ongoing one, a fight that requires constant vigilance, a willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
So while it's a disturbing and challenging read, Mein Kampf is a book that we can learn from. It can help us understand the dangers of extremism and the importance of defending the values of freedom, democracy, and human dignity.
Exactly. It's a warning from history, a reminder that the seeds of hatred and violence can take root anywhere,
Yeah.
and that we must be prepared to confront them wherever they may arise.
You know, it's wild to think about how this book, Mein Kampf, went from being a relative obscurity to being almost a compulsory text in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, it's a strange trajectory, isn't it? I mean, initially it was dismissed by many as just the ramblings of a fringe politician.
Hmm.
But as the Nazi Party gained traction, so did the book.
Yeah, it's almost like it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people read it, the more they were exposed to his ideas, and the more those ideas seemed to take hold.
Exactly, it became a tool for indoctrination,
Yeah.
used to spread the Nazi ideology and justify the regime's actions.
Right, right.
Imagine school children being forced to read this hateful, twisted worldview. It's a chilling thought.
Yeah, and that brings up a difficult question. How do we deal with this book today? It's clearly a historical document. It's important for understanding the rise of Nazism, but it's also full of dangerous and hateful ideas.
Right, it's a tough balancing act. Um, some argue that it should be banned, kept out of circulation entirely. Others say that's censorship and that we need to confront these ideas directly.
Yeah, I can see both sides of the argument. I mean, on the one hand, you don't want to give a platform to hate speech, but on the other hand, if you try to suppress it, it doesn't just disappear. It might even become more alluring, this kind of forbidden knowledge.
Exactly. It's like trying to push a beach ball underwater. You might be able to keep it submerged for a while, but it'll eventually pop back up, often with even more force.
So how do you strike that balance? How do you study something like Mein Kampf without risking, the spread of its toxic ideology?
Well, context is key. It needs to be studied within the framework of history, with critical analysis and a clear understanding of its dangers. It's not a book to be read in isolation, but rather as a piece as a larger puzzle, helping us understand a specific time and place and the forces that shaped it.
It's also a reminder that we can't just dismiss Hitler as a madman or a monster. While his ideas were abhorrent, he was a product of his time.
Right.
And his rise to power was facilitated by, this complex web of social, political, and economic factors.
Yeah, that's an important point. We have to be careful not to simplify history or to demonize individuals to the point where we fail to understand the broader context that allowed them to flourish.
Right? It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We need to grapple with these difficult parts of our history so that we can learn from them and prevent, similar atrocities from happening again.
Exactly. And that means being aware of the warning signs, the subtle shifts in rhetoric and political discourse that can pave the way for extremism to take hold.
Mein Kampf provides us with a roadmap of how hate can be normalized, how propaganda can be used to manipulate the masses, and how a charismatic leader can exploit fear and resentment for their own gain.
Right. It's a sobering reminder that the forces that gave rise to Nazism are not confined to the past. We see echoes of them in the world today.
Yeah.
The rise of nationalism, the scapegoating of minorities, the erosion of democratic values.
It's call to action, really.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be complacent or to take our freedoms for granted. We have to actively defend the values of tolerance, equality, and human dignity.
And that starts with education, with understanding the lessons of history and being aware of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of, seemingly benign rhetoric. We need to be critical thinkers, able to see through propaganda and to challenge those who seek to divide us and exploit our fears.
So while Mein Kampf is a book that, fills us with horror and disgust, it's also a book that can teach us valuable lessons.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder of the fragility of our freedoms, the seductive allure of extremism, and the enduring power of ideas both for good and for evil.
It's a book that should be studied, not celebrated. A warning from the past that we must heed if we are to build a better future.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into Mein Kampf. It's been, a heavy but I think important conversation.
I agree. This is a book that, everyone should be aware of, even if they never actually read it.
Right.
The ideas it contains are too dangerous to ignore.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more, there are lots of great resources available online and in libraries. Do your own research, come to your own conclusions, and most importantly, never stop questioning and challenging the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.